Welcome to the Let's Talk series of Tech and the Arts, the podcast for the Arts Management and Technology Lab. Our goal is to exchange ideas, shine a spotlight on pressing issues, and stay on top of the trends. My name is Victoria Sprouse, the podcast producer, and today I have with me Liz Forrey and Ethan Jones, contributors to the Arts Management and Technology Lab, to talk about data collection, how arts organizations can use that data to their advantage, and whether or not it's actually prudent to do so. Thank you both for being here.
Yay, we're happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Victoria.
So, Ethan, let's start with you. Tell us the basics about how streaming services track our data and what they do with it.
Yeah. So I'm super interested in understanding film and television streaming services and how they work, because they really have come to the forefront of a lot of our data usage and of consumers' minds, especially in the past couple years since the pandemic. So when I'm talking about streaming services, I'm talking about your Netflix, your Hulu, your Amazon Prime Video, which have all been around the block for the past 5 years or so. But the newer players to the game, like HBO Max, Disney Plus, Peacock, Apple TV Plus, and
I feel
Paramount
like every time I
Plus.
turn my TV on, there's a new streaming
There's a new one
service.
every single day. It's ridiculous. We're getting like CNN Plus now.
That's crazy. I haven't even heard of that one. Yeah.
It's so interesting because we didn't have any of these like 3 years ago. And so there's this new, totally different culture that the entertainment industry is trying to get its grip on, and how to grapple with all these different choices. And consumers are trying to understand. They don't want to subscribe to 9 different streaming services, all for $11.99, you know?
Yeah, I often ask my friends, like, a big like dinner question is, if you could only have like 3 streaming services, what would it be?
Yeah, and so these streaming services are now understanding, hey, we really need to make sure we get all these consumers' attention and make sure that we are one of the 2 to 3 streaming services that they choose to subscribe through first. And so
Using the data to do that?
Absolutely. And so when they're gathering all sorts of data, it's stuff like what demographics are watching certain TV shows, what retention rates are like for viewers, what kind of genres certain users are watching more frequently, and many other statistics that each streamer tracks and then analyzes so they can create the most personable experience. And they also take from other streaming services. So they really are just, it's like a lot of pundits have called it the streaming wars, to make sure that they really are on top, to be at the consumer's forefront of their mind.
So that's basically what they're using all their data
that's
for.
the purpose of it.
Right.
Yeah.
And then for Liz, same question for you. What does big tech do with my data?
So I guess the question really is, what doesn't big tech do with your data? And there's 3 main things. I mean, you could go on and on, but really there's advertising. They share your data with other companies, and they enhance things like AI and facial recognition. But I would really say the biggest is advertising. You know, with their data, they are looking through your interactions. They determine what you like, what you don't, locations that you're frequently at, what you're looking at when you're in a specific area. And they do that to basically enhance how they advertise things to you.
It's so crazy to me when I think about having my location services turned on my phone. I only ever think about it in terms of, oh, Google Maps is going to help me get to where I need to go. I never think of it as like, well, now Alphabet owns my data and is probably selling it or sharing it with another company.
Or both.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's the truth, because a lot of what they do with this, besides their own internal data collection, is sell it to other third-party organizations who also want to know your location for where you are near, or what demographic of an area that you're in, to kind of glean some insight into what they can market to you in the consumer, idea.
So I think for a lot of millennials and Generation Zers who grew up kind of at the same time that the internet came into fruition, I am a part of that generation. It's always been an unspoken rule that you will hand over your data in order to gain access to the wonderful world of the internet. But how are companies using your data, and should we be more concerned about that?
I think there should be concern. I mean, going back to how companies use your data, we touched on that a bit, but it really does come down to advertising for me, because there is this idea of total control. There's hundreds of court cases against big tech companies, But Meta and Google, or Alphabet rather, both have advertising monopolies because of the barriers to entry that they put up for the cost of advertising on the respective platforms. And thus, with all that info, there's unlimited control on what you see, what's suggested to you. And I think that, it's hard because everything's so connected. And getting back to this idea of monopoly is that we can't do anything but accept those terms and conditions.
Right.
I
mean, I don't even read. I mean, who reads them?
No.
You just accept them.
Oh, you just accept them.
And they know that.
Right. And it's hard. And that's kind of like this sticky situation because it's like they have control over a lot of things. They have control not just what you're looking at to buy, but controls on news that you're watching and stuff. And it comes to like revenue. I mean, they have so much of their income is just from advertising. So by getting that data, it's really important to them. And I guess I can't say how do we not do that, but there's definitely a wariness that everybody should have, even if right now it's almost impossible to not accept the terms and conditions.
Speaking to that kind of wariness that everyone should have, when people buy the shiny new toys of VR headsets or AI glasses, smartwatches, fitness trackers, I mean, I'm wearing a Fitbit right now.
I am too.
Yeah.
And that's owned by Alphabet.
What should people know about the data that they're unknowingly or sometimes knowingly handing over to, well, I guess in the case of Fitbit, Alphabet, but giant tech companies behind specs?
The first thing I think of is nothing is sacred.
Okay.
There are some good things that have come from any learning and any data and, getting information on people and things to improve whatever service we have. But I think that it really turns out to be a lot of information that you're handing over. Like their new AR glasses that basically track everything that you do. And
Wow.
It's been beta. Yeah. And it shows people around and it takes like pictures.
Wow.
And so that could be cool to enhance like facial recognition or certain AI. And, I'm sure there could be some accessibility uses for that in the future.
But on the other hand,
It's like, not to get too sci-fi, what villainous thing could happen. But there's a lot of information and you can get a pretty good picture of a whole entire person's lives without really knowing about it.
Right. Earlier this year, Apple said that they were developing new AirPods that could double as a hearing aid. And so I was like, oh, that's so cool, was obviously my first thought. And then my second thought was, but then they can hear everything that someone says to me.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, right. And I know, and it's already a problem and an issue that we've heard that people have, been discussing with phones and mics and this and that. So it's already like in the works. And again, there's really great things, but what are you giving up when you're doing that?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to just be doom and gloom. Let's flip over to some of maybe the benefits of data collection. We'll see what your opinion is, Ethan. Which leads me to a question about entertainment and streaming services. Streaming services have been gathering our data since before they were even streaming services.
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember when Netflix was just a service that mailed DVDs to my house.
Yeah.
I used to go to the mailbox to get
mailed
that
me High
red
School
envelope.
Musical, yeah.
They've paved the way, Netflix specifically has paved the way in data-driven content decisions, creating House of Cards in part because their data from those DVD mailings told them it would be a huge success. So if streaming services were to make that data public, which I know they don't really want to do at the moment,
no, not at all.
How could arts and entertainment organizations, as well as users, benefit from that transparency?
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting what you said about Netflix really being the originator of this data methodology that they use, and Netflix is on its way to really becoming as big as kind of what Liz was talking about, Google and Meta and all of that. Like Netflix is really just paving its way in the stock market and everything to climbing to the top, which is scary, but also like just very interesting to see because it really does just focus on entertainment first and foremost. And like you said, Netflix and all the other streaming services right now are holding tight to their arms this data that they have about their viewership data for their specific consumers. But really, it's just interesting to me. I came to this question originally because I grew up measuring box office statistics for films, and I guess that's kind of why I'm here. But really since like the 1980s, actually since the 1930s, Variety was tracking like the box office grosses for Broadway shows, and then the 80s Variety started understanding that they could use the grosses that movies make at the theater and turn it into a marketing scheme. They really started tracking that, and then it became mandatory for all studios to announce how much money each movie is making each day. And so I was always tracking what movies are making on their opening weekend, how much money it is. And then studios are also tracking that, and they turn it into a marketing scheme. On Sunday, they can announce that Spider-Man was the #1 grossing movie in the world this past weekend, and that can turn a lot of people into watching it and they can get more money.
Which is kind of what now streaming services do, right?
And it's so interesting. Actually, just a couple weeks ago, Netflix announced a new website called Top 10 Netflix, and they're, for the first time ever, releasing the total number of hours of their top 10 films and TV shows and how many hours each of those entities were watched over the week.
Okay, so getting a little more transparent.
I know. So it just happened a couple weeks ago for the first time ever. And Netflix has the power to do that because right now they are #1 in terms of having the amount of power and the workforce that's needed to really be a catalyst in that field. So it's super interesting that it's starting to turn over a leaf just a little bit. But since streaming services have started, like I said, they're all competing for the eyes and ears of audiences. And audiences are becoming more intentional with what they want to choose. They're choosing only 2 or 3 subscription services. And so it's becoming sort of a war. And I think that's why they're so not wanting to, let go of this information. But an argument that has been shown is that if they're holding this information so tight, it's going to be hard for the entertainment industry to really learn kind of what makes a movie successful, and what makes a television show important to people, and what kind of shows are connecting with people and what kinds of shows are not. And so that some argue that this data is super, super important to understanding where the industry should go in the future. And it's not good that they're holding it,
Speaking of using data in order to retain a consumer base. Today, it's common for everyone's landing page on Netflix to look different. I'm not surprised that my friend's landing page looks different than mine. We have entirely different interests. But do you think that the idea of feeding people what they want in order to retain viewership doesn't give people enough freedom to discover new programming that's different than what they typically consume? It's kind of a chicken and an egg scenario.
Yeah.
Do I tell Netflix what I'm interested in, or does Netflix tell me what I should watch based on my previous habits and the data they have on me?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I really do think that a lot of people who work for these companies are trying to get a good balance of that, making sure that there is, a hand-picked selection of titles that you already have shown interest in from the beginning. When you first log into Netflix, they ask, what are the 3 shows that you would like to watch the most? And they have a selection just so they can start understanding your habits a little bit.
On Hulu, I know, because I just recently set up a Hulu account, and they ask you, what categories you're interested in, what shows do you watch?
Yeah, they do that. But they're also, I know that some streaming services are trying to do a balance now of, introducing a lot more, for example, foreign language television shows and films. The popularity of Squid Game really exploded, at least in America, and, actually all over the world. But now a lot of people in America are more prone to surfing on and understanding and exploring different foreign language films and television shows, which is awesome, but they don't really know where to go for that. And so I know Netflix and other streaming services are trying to group different types of IP into certain ways to where they can translate to an audience being happy. But
that's great. I love that they're making that effort.
Yeah, so there are benefits to this, data collection, of course, but it's interesting, where do you draw the line, for certain types of things? Like Liz was saying, Apple and Meta are all just, it seems like they're collecting almost everything about you. And I don't know when Netflix and co. are going to start following the similar paths.
Yeah, and I kind of have the same question for you, Liz. To what degree should we be worried about big tech influencing more than just our purchase decisions with advertising, but, creating echo chambers that affect our very beliefs? And maybe we should already be more worried than we are.
I'm back with the doom and gloom. And it's interesting because I know, Ethan, in the streaming service land, there's talk about the echo chamber of is this actually good content, or is it what the algorithm has?
Nobody knows.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
And we don't know that. But in big tech, we know a little more, but it's that same thing of like, is this what we're actually wanting to see, or is this something that's been generated for us? And I think we should be worried. I think a lot of people who are really up on these things are already worried. I mean, you have recent whistleblowers like Frances Hogan from Meta, who came out, on not just election misinformation, which we know is something that happened, and Facebook had known that it had happened. The platform, which then was Facebook, is now Meta.
Right.
Knows what had happened and did nothing to stop it. So that's one thing there, is seeing how memes and false information and stuff can already influence a nation's thinking. And then you have another thing that came out of Frances Hogan's trial, and the idea that Facebook already has data on how poorly social media affects, I believe it was Instagram, whichever, just in general, social media affects teenage girls' self-esteem. And so contained in that social echo chamber of getting information and regurgitating information in tandem with this data collection and monopoly over advertising, and which companies have the funds to actually get into advertising on Google's platforms or Alphabet's platforms and Meta's platforms. It comes to this place of huge companies, lots of money, controlled by two big conglomerates who can not only control what you're seeing and what you want to buy, but control what stuff you're seeing about politics and what articles you're reading. So I think there needs to be some wariness and going out there to find different information on your own. And I say that as a caveat because you're going to go to Google.
Yeah. And I want to add, I think it's also super important to acknowledge that these four companies are starting to have, a monopoly on the marketplace. And that's kind of one of the scariest parts, is that it's not the fact that our information is being taken, which that is a certain big part, but the fact that Google and Meta all have this information about us, that it's just this specific company that knows so much about us, not just different companies,
Yeah. And then in turn, as we were kind of talking about earlier, they do share that information with other companies.
Yeah.
With the other big companies.
The other big companies, other things. And there's another thing that I think is necessary to know if people don't. Meta, Apple, Alphabet, and Amazon, and among other companies, together they have about 502 other subsidiaries, mergers, etc. And it changes every day. They're always acquiring or getting rid of businesses. But so they own not just their own four big companies, but they own hundreds of other companies that aren't just tech companies. But so when you realize that you're sharing your information with them, you might not even realize it because it's under a different name, but it's really owned by these bigger organizations.
And it's definitely a big debate topic. Who should, should the regulation come from the government? Should these corporations practice good social responsibility? Should we take it on ourselves as consumers to just know these things and either accept them or do something about it? It's a really big question.
Yeah, I think it's really just a big question of ethics. Like you said, it really is everybody's job to be the most ethical they can be. But at the end of the day, it really is about these companies. They have the power. They have that data. They have the information about these people. And it's their job to make sure that they're using it responsibly.
And as you were saying earlier, Liz, I mean, it's almost like you have to be a part of these companies' products.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, and that's why
to live in the 21st century.
Absolutely. And that's why I have such strong feelings that the government should take action. I mean, there's already it's not just the United States government. It actually got really pushed in the EU a few years ago, and now big tech litigation is coming up a lot more in the United States. And we want to practice ethics, like you're saying, Ethan, but they're not. They haven't been. And sometimes they have, like Apple released in iOS 14, now that consumers can choose if they want to share their data with the App Store and et cetera, which is a really good thing for consumers. Yeah. But when it comes down to owning everything from advertising to social media to even other entertainment industries. I mean, I wrote an article for AMT Lab earlier in November, and these big tech companies, their biggest place in the market besides tech is entertainment. It's the second biggest that they have like a grasp in. So yeah, long story short, I would love to say that they can just have ethical and best practices, but it comes down to that there's been hundreds of cases in court that there just needs to be some government regulation. And I can't say what that'll look like because that's a lot of decentralization.
Let's pivot a little and talk about how arts and nonprofit organizations can utilize this data as part of their best practices for marketing or audience retention. This is a question for either of you. I don't know who wants to go first.
Yeah, I think it comes down to that idea that Liz was talking about earlier with Google, like selective transparency is something that big companies have taken practice in. Not just that Big Four, but also these streaming companies that I'm talking about are really just only deciding specific parts of the data that they collect to announce to the public, and then that can come to the form public. They can say, oh, we are being transparent, but they're not being transparent about the whole picture. And so that is where a lot of the problems derive in terms of that. But in terms of like, the arts management world and nonprofit organizations, those big companies set precedents for those smaller companies, that ultimately do have an effect on everyday people, in Pittsburgh, in the surrounding area, around the world. And so it's up to those companies to set an example.
And Liz, did you have anything to add?
Honestly, I agree because, data is great, for nonprofits because it helps knowing your demographics, the wants and needs and interests of your patrons, and allows to, have more better and accurate programming. But keeping with that, transparency is just best practice.
It's a best practice.
Yeah, it's a best practice. And, I've talked at least a lot about the bad of data, but like there are great things that can come from this, and being able to do that, I think is important. And just saying it, I'm just kind of echoing what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think it's important like that arts, nonprofits and arts organizations really do understand the importance of data as well, not assuming that like Google equals data and that equals bad. Like, like these like super awesome smaller organizations can use the same methodologies and the same power to uncover the best in their organizations and make a difference in their own way, which is something that sometimes it can get lost in the sauce. These organizations need to understand that data is still power, and it can be used in such beautiful ways to really bring art to marginalized communities, for example. Like that's something you can just gather statistics about certain communities and understand what is needed in those communities. And so it's super important to understand that, data isn't necessarily a villain.
Yeah, it seems like a high wire act of trying to balance artistic integrity, introducing people to programming they've never heard of before, that maybe gives them a new perspective, pushes against their comfort zone, kind of what you were talking about earlier, Ethan. Balancing between that and simply using audience data to give people exactly what they want in order to increase profits.
Yeah.
So what are the potential opportunities and pitfalls of arts and entertainment organizations using data collection to drive decisions about what they create next, what types of museum exhibits they put on, what their next season of shows or performances will look like?
I mean, I have some thoughts.
Go.
I think that balancing that is a big thing, but I think that any innovative arts institution, whether entertainment or nonprofit or for-profit, they will look at patron data and be able to say, here is our safe programming, here is our kind of out there, like breaking the barriers programming, and they can use data, and they will use data to simply bring in their revenue that they need to bring in because they need to have some sort of steady income. But and conversely, the only issue with focusing on data is that it slows everything. It prevents them from looking to the future and saying, what's the new next thing? What can we do? That really entices our audience.
If you're only looking at past data, how can you see the future?
Exactly. Yeah, because you're not... Yeah, you put it perfectly. And making sure that you do that in a place that is kind of balanced, with looking at your data and saying, this is what we've done. These are the demographics of people we have. These are their interests. And then looking at what's on the market, what's new and experimental. And that's a really great way to kind of marry the two and continue to be innovative while still using data and catering to who you need to cater to, but while breaking the barriers and opening new doors to things.
I love that. I think that's great. I think that, you gave us some gloom and doom, but also some positivity from both of you. Got really interesting, both sides of the argument today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much,
Thanks.
Victoria. This has been a blast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Yes. Go data.
Thanks for listening to the AMT Lab podcast, and don't forget to subscribe wherever podcasts are found. Let us know what you thought by visiting our website, amt-lab.org. That's amt-lab.org. Or you can email us at amtlabcmu@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at Tech in the Arts, or on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Arts Management and Technology Lab. Join us next time for an interview episode with Jim McCarthy about the streaming of live theatrical performances. Thanks again for listening. If you found this episode informative, educational, or inspirational, then send this to another arts aficionado in your life.